Once the game was done, the team couldn't help but feel frustrated. There had been so much they'd been unable to do. Having to cut concepts and pull back on their more ambitious ideas due to technical limitations still bothered them. Within a week of Silent Hill's release, the PlayStation 2 was announced that March.
This thing broken?
The world of Silent Hill was at a standstill. The game had been massively popular, more than anyone could have imagined. It was the top of the sales charts in multiple countries, glowing reviews were being written for it in many publications, and a massive global fanbase was soon to rise. The problem was, there was no plan for Silent Hill 2, and there was no one to direct said project. Toyama Keiichiro, feeling uncertain of his own skills, stepped away from the series he had pioneered, and left Konami, leaving a vacuum behind. He had written the story, developed the world's lore, designed many of its locations, and had a heavy influence on the overall feeling and atmosphere of the game. Taking up his mantle would be a heavy burden. Who was going to do it? At first, it seemed it would be Imamura Akihiro, a programmer who had been part of the original 4 members of the team. The Silent Hill 2 project began in much the same way the first had. The main team, which consisted of many returning members, had joint meetings and discussed ideas and plans for their game. These pre-production meetings began sometime in September of 1999, and 3 months later, full production likely began when Sato Takayoshi moved to the United States in December. Of the original central team, Oshima Naoto, Toyama Keiichiro, Sato Naoko, and Takahashi Isao would not return. Returning to the series would be Sato Takayoshi, Ito Masahiro, Tsuboyama Masashi, Owaku Hiroyuki, and Imamura. They'd proven themselves. They'd proven the Silent Hill brand. This time, they'd go bigger and better, and so planned on the budget for something truly breathtaking. But the bigger their ideas got, the larger the team became. New hires to Konami for Silent Hill 2 included Nakazawa Kazuhide, who would work on character motion for Silent Hill 2, as well as Murakoshi Suguru, Silent Hill 2's drama director. Both would go on to direct a Silent Hill game of their own. Soon, Imamura realized they were growing too big to manage. He'd started as the director of a small team, but said team had more than tripled in size, with at least 60 people working on it at any given time, as opposed to the 15 of the previous game. Imamura realized they needed someone to coordinate and control these teams, and the role fell to him. Imamura took on a producing role, and Tsuboyama Masashi stepped forward to direct. Tsuboyama was born in Niigata in 1970, was raised in Tokyo, and entered Tama Art University's Department of Graphic Design in 1991, before joining Konami in 1995. In the first game, he was a background designer, and nothing in the interviews implies a large role. The birth of Silent Hill 2 came from conversations among the central team of the kind of stories they wanted to create. Everyone contributed ideas and themes they liked, scenarios and dialogue for the game, with scenario writer Owaku compiling these ideas and working them into a story. Afterward, the team would meet again to discuss and tweak these ideas into a final format. Many of these contributions from specific members are unknown, but we do know it was Sato Takayoshi who provided the final central concept of crime and guilt, and it was Sato who wrote most of the lines of the female characters. For Silent Hill 2, the team wanted to go deeper and darker. They wanted something psychological. The first game had begun by building the town and the programming, focused on establishing what they were making before deciding the story they'd tell. Developing a workable 3D engine and environment was the major focus, and as a consequence, their story was dreamlike and full of holes. This time, they had their setting, and they knew what the game would look like. Now they could focus on writing a story from scratch, on creating a developed narrative rather than cutting and pasting one to fit the game. Multiple interviews with Tsuboyama and Imamura focus on this idea: the desire to tell a story, a new story, a, quote, presentation of something completely different, focused on the emotions people feel to express a deep, profound story. The focus on a, quote, movie-like experience is clear in multiple interviews, as major figures on the team describe Silent Hill 2 as a more movie-like experience than a video game. This would cause problems from time to time. Balancing the game elements against their more artistic movie inspirations was difficult. Camera angles that enhance the cinematic feeling might not be good for gameplay, and vice versa, and the team was constantly working on the balance between the two. This wasn't an easy process. Everyone had their own ideas about the game's scenario, and not everyone agreed. The main story changed at least twice over the course of development, and details of these lost versions of Silent Hill 2 are sparse. One version of the story drew heavily on the history and folk stories that have developed around Jack the Ripper, the serial killer who ravaged London in 1888. The names of multiple characters are pulled from that history. 2 of the Ripper victims were named Mary. James was originally a man with 2 personalities, one of which was named Joseph, the name of a man suspected of being the Ripper. Holdovers of this idea appear in the Brookhaven section of game, where notes discussing mentally ill patients use names like Joseph. Eventually, they would come to a consensus on what would be the cornerstone of their game: a Russian novel that explores the human psyche and the soul of a criminal, Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. First serialized in Russia throughout 1888, Crime and Punishment is a haunting narrative of one young man's attempt to escape poverty through murder. At first terrified of the act, he inevitably commits the crime and his life begins to unravel. A deeply psychological novel, Crime and Punishment explores what it means to be a criminal and the depths to which guilt and sorrow can drive people. After committing his crime, the protagonist's sorrows only increase, and nearly all of them are self-made. He can't escape his own guilt, and begins to suffer hallucinations, fevers, forgetfulness, bouts of fainting, and unhinged behavior. In his attempts to justify his behavior, his own subconscious mind grows more unsteady. He dreams of blood and violence, suffers waking nightmares, and loses hours of time to fugue states. His guilt creates his own nightmare. Another character in the book murders his wife and is tormented by visions of her ghost. The man eventually kills himself to escape his suffering, while the protagonist admits his guilt and turns himself in, ending the story in prison. His guilty conscience is relieved by facing the truth of his crime and owning up to his mistakes. The suppression of memory, the overwhelming guilt and need to be judged, the desire to be redeemed, the themes of imprisonment and criminality, and of course murder, all find their roots in this haunting tale. The focus on madness and illness, how committing crimes can drive a person to enter into another world, are all incredibly similar to the themes and motifs of Silent Hill 2. The book wasn't the only inspiration, of course. Multiple works of fiction, especially film, would have heavy influence on the game. Ito Masahiro says that in terms of production, he remembers referring to Blue Velvet, Lost Highway, A Clockwork Orange, Full Metal Jacket, and to a lesser extent, the works of Alejandro Jodorowsky and the videos of Chris Cunningham. Lost Highway in particular seems to be very influential on the overall plot. It focuses on a man with amnesia and a dead wife, and a videotape that reveals the truth. If Silent Hill was always a game about a foggy, haunted town, Silent Hill 2 was always a game about a relationship, The first scene the team conceived of was the scene in the prison, in which Maria taunts James by mimicking Mary. It's the same scene that plays in the opening trailer of the finished game. It is this scene which sets the tone and mood for the entire experience. From the Jack the Ripper concept to the final Crime and Punishment storyline, the game is centered upon two people with multiple personas or aspects. Jack the Ripper was a man who had a murderous side, and one of his victims, Mary Kelly, was known for having a dark side and for struggling with alcoholism. One prominent Ripper identity theory is that he was Mary Kelly's romantic partner, who killed prostitutes to try and scare Mary off the street, as she was a sex worker herself. Their relationship was troubled and at times violent, and it was this emotionally and physically abusive pairing which ended in violence and death that may have inspired Silent Hill 2. The deeper, darker Silent Hill would not be as dark as the team wanted. Certain elements were cut out of fears of censorship or the thought it might truly cross the line. Mary's death, for instance, originally had upsetting audio of her struggling, which was removed. Other removals involved gameplay concepts where the player could cut up enemy monsters, removing limbs and even heads. Another content removal came by accident. A crashing hard drive lost the team 18 gigs of data, including a much longer stream of audio of Eddie vomiting in the bathroom. Taking this as a sign from above to tone it down, Sato Takayoshi shortened the scene. So they had their starting point, an idea Sato Takayoshi put forth, writing about a criminal driven mad by guilt. The story itself would be the combined efforts of Sato, Owaku, and a new team member, Jeremy Blostein, whose official role was translation, motion capture, and voiceover direction. But as the primary English speaker of the team, he was the one who took Owaku's scenarios and Sato's dialogues and turned them into English. Imamura was not as directly involved, but he still had influence, and many decisions related to the game's playability stem from him. The choice to avoid using game-like elements was his, and it continued into the second game. The high difficulty of the first game had been a major complaint, so this time Silent Hill 2 would have multiple difficulty levels for both puzzles and combat. Imamura wanted anyone, including those new to games, and especially women, to be able to play the game. A young housewife would thank the team in a chat room for creating the easy mode. Silent Hill 2 was the first game she was ever able to play. The tank controls of the first game had also been somewhat of an issue. Tank refers to a style of game movement in which the player character is moved based on the character's position, not the position of the camera. Silent Hill 2 would include an option for different types of controls, one of which Imamura referred to as the Mario style in interviews. While Tsuboyama's known input is not as concrete, it's clear the overall themes and direction of the game came from him. In an interview, he says that what he ultimately wanted to create in Silent Hill 2 was insanity and love, and those two themes would be at the heart of the game. When the Sony PlayStation arrived on the scene in the 1990s, it was a game changer. The use of CDs meant games designed for it could have a great deal more memory, which meant they could create more complex games than before. It came with its own toolset that allowed programmers to use PC programming languages rather than working with console-specific programs or hardware. It was revolutionary for its time. In March of 2001, Sony's second foray into the console market would arrive on the scene. But while the PlayStation 2 would go on to be a major success for the company, and one of the most popular consoles of all time, it would be a very different situation behind the scenes. Developing for the PlayStation 2 was hard, where the PlayStation was accepted as a marvel for developers who were excited to be able to go further than they ever had. The PlayStation 2 offered greater possibilities as well as greater frustrations. Its major competitors at the time were far simpler. The Dreamcast was a breeze, but unfortunately it would not last out the year. The Xbox, which would come later, was basically a PC in a box, but it didn't have the established player base or the many benefits of the PS2. The PS2 was backwards compatible. An entire library of games already existed for it the moment it was released. It could play DVDs and was about the price of a DVD player at the time, so a lot of non-gamers bought the device for its multiple uses. As time went on, many incredibly beloved game franchises would be on the PlayStation 2, and a passionate player base was formed. The games industry could hardly ignore the console, which meant they'd have to learn to work with it. Not being too technically inclined myself, I looked to developers to see how they explained the difficulties of the PS2. An article from the time quotes multiple Japanese game developers and discusses their difficulties with the console, including Silent Hill's own Kitao Gozo. If you focus on making full use of all the specs, it will be very expensive and time-consuming to produce a game, Kitao said. His theory to PS2's success was to focus on doing one thing very well, such as focusing on action and cutting corners on art or environment. Another developer, who remained anonymous, complained that the PlayStation had been created with a library of content to go with it, to make developers' jobs easier. The PlayStation 2 wasn't, which meant they had to create everything themselves. When it comes to making a game, you won't get far without a game engine. And when it comes to game programming engines, you have two typical ways to go. Use a pre-made engine that you license, such as the modern Unity software, or make your own engine, start to finish. Silent Hill 2 began in late 1999, when the PlayStation 2 wasn't officially released yet. The console had no extra utilities to go with it, which probably meant it didn't have any pre-made game engines. If Silent Hill 2 was going to have a future, someone was going to have to make that engine, and that person would be Hatakeda Norihito. Hatakeda was born in 1972 and entered the Tokyo Institute of Technology in 1992. He would join Konami while still in school in 1996, graduating 2 years later. His first credited project was NHL Blades of Steel 2000, and he joined the Silent Hill 2 team in its earliest beginnings, likely in late 1999. Official game credits don't go into his work on the game's engine. He's credited as the graphic engine programmer, referring to the game's effects, such as the fog. But Ito Masahiro has made clear on his Twitter account just how invaluable Hatakeda was to the team, explaining that the base of the engine of Silent Hill 2 was made by Hatakeda without taking holidays over the course of 6 months. The problem was a matter of skill. Not everyone on the team was capable of creating an engine, and thus the team couldn't avoid putting a burden on certain team members, in Ito's words. They had to have an engine, and a programmer had to step up to the plate. No one else was capable, so Hatakeda took the lead. His work would be the backbone of the rest of K-Set's Silent Hill games. Both Silent Hill 2 and Silent Hill 3 would use his engine, and a special thanks for him on 4 implies that it too at least owed part of its programming to Hatakeda. During the time between 2001 and 2004, 8 Japanese patents with Hatakeda's name on them would be related to the Silent Hill series. The language in these patents often focuses on displaying media and image generation, and the creation of 3D spaces. Some of them use the word fog and discuss how to improve the creation of gas. Another involves the brightness and darkness of the game, and a portable light. All of this implies his heavy presence across the game and his involvement in the appearance of the fog, various visual effects, the lighting, and shadow. His work on the fog would be revolutionary. In the first game, a basic fog texture was used to hide the rough edges of the game, but the look became incredibly popular and emblematic of the series. Even though it was no longer needed, it wasn't going away. Instead, Silent Hill 2's fog would be rendered in a far more realistic way. Instead of a flat image texture creating the illusion of fog, it is volumetrically rendered, meaning a computer program figures out the size and appearance of the fog at any moment and creates it. In addition, the superiority of the PlayStation 2 included its ability to draw translucency fast,
which meant that fog and shadow in the game were far superior in appearance to the previous title. The patents on the fog show that the program involved changing direction and size with the wind, creating a far more natural appearance. And in interviews, the team discusses how the fog was even capable of dispersing around the player as they walked through it. Of course, Hatakeda wasn't the only programmer. There were many others involved in the various systems of Silent Hill 2, with a total of 15 programmers, as opposed to the 6 of Silent Hill. Of those 15, a handful had worked on the first game, including Ogiso Kazumasa, Mizuochi Yuki, Sugai Kazutoshi, and Owaku Hiroyuki. Ogiso, in particular, relates to a fun anecdote related to Silent Hill's history. When it came to creating endings for Silent Hill, the team would come up with a game to farm ideas for a goof ending. A suggestion box was set up with the question, "What's the real reason Silent Hill is like this?" One of the answers given was a dog, and the team was delighted by the idea. They pushed it through to become one of the endings of Silent Hill 2, in spite of the fact that the voice actor for James, Guy Sihi, absolutely did not understand it or think it was funny. Harry Inaba insisted to him it was Japanese humor and that he give it a shot. The original idea for the dog ending was Ogiso Kazumasa's. Mizuochi Yuki would continue working on character programming for Silent Hill 2, and his work would involve multiple new programs and patents related to the game. One of them was a program centered on keeping the player character moving in the right direction, even when the camera changed positions. Since Silent Hill 2 has many fixed angles and restricted points of view, a program that would keep James going in the right direction, regardless of angle, was incredibly important. He was also the programmer that developed the system that would turn the player character's head towards an item when it is close by, indicating something was near. Working on collision programming was Ojima Yukinori, a Konami employee since at least 1994. Working on various programming for titles like International Track and Field, Nagano Winter Olympics, and Doraemon. Collision programming involves the act of hitting the environment or other subjects in the game and how the player character reacts. When James stumbles into a wall, his physical motions are controlled by the collision programming. The first Silent Hill suffered a bit of critique on its collision. Dedicating a single programmer to the role may have been in response to these critiques. Another new programmer was Fukushima Hayato, whose first game seems to have been Silent Hill 2. His Western credits are only on the Silent Hill series, working on the shadow programming alongside Hatakeda. 2 patents in Fukushima's name filed in March 2003 relate to the image processing device capable of suitably displaying an object arranged in a spatial area as a light volume. The language of the patent implies that Fukushima's work is what allowed the flashlight to create realistic lighting, where moving close to something or farther away changed the lighting and shadow of the area. His career outside Silent Hill is unfortunately a mystery. Ohashi Naoto worked on sub-programming for the game, which involves programming that works within the system to fulfill certain roles behind the scenes. He'd been at Konami since 1998 working on the battle and sub-programming for Mitsumete Night. His work on Silent Hill 2 was likely more minimal, because he was working on a second game at the time, 2001's Shadow of Destiny, where his role as event programmer may have been more involved. Effect programming in Silent Hill 2 would fall to Hidehisa Harada, who started his Konami career programming on Suikoden 2. His unique contribution to the game would involve the loading screen. A patent with his name describes the creation of an effect involving footprint textures that fade and move. Silent Hill 2 was the first game in the series to be on the PlayStation 2, and the developers behind it were treading new ground. It was a learning experience and a trial for those who were attempting to understand a new system while developing all the tools they'd need to use it from scratch. Silent Hill 2 couldn't have existed without the hard work of these programmers who paved the way for the series on the PS2. More than any game in the series, fans of Silent Hill 2 have dug into the workings of the game to understand and uncover its code. Over the years, they've found plenty of secrets, including a mini-map and a Save Anywhere feature that was likely used during the game's development. Other discoveries include the ability to use the debug menu on the PC version of the game, revealing the game's collision and the area line draw, the layout that marks the edges of the map. Among these colored lines are red rectangles that act as the triggers for various events when you walk over them, from triggering sounds in the background to the appearance of monsters in the area. These lines also mark the positioning of the camera, and the menu can be used to move said camera in various directions. The PlayStation 2 was a controversial console among developers. It was difficult to learn and came with few additional programs to make their lives easier. The one piece of technology that Sony did develop to work with their system was called the S-Force 3D Sound Library, a middleware program developed to enable 3D surround sound, and it was a feature that Silent Hill 2 would debut to the world, and is mentioned in many of the articles premiering the arrival of the program in April of 2001. Using 2-channel front speakers, the S-Force could emulate the experience of 3D sound in a game, making it seem as if the sound itself was moving with the events on the screen. In this way, a monster approaching James could sound as if it were coming from in front or behind him, and the sound of said creature would move as James moved. This was a revolutionary technology, and one that would go a long way towards making Silent Hill 2 stand out. In fact, it is still a technology in use among Sony's programs, though today it appears to primarily be used in modern television sets. September 2000, a year after Silent Hill 2's development had begun, and a year before it would finally release. In London, game developers, journalists, and fans were gathering at the Grand Hall Convention Center in Olympia, looking forward to seeing announcements about games like Diablo and Metal Gear Solid. Unfortunately, those looking for Silent Hill would be disappointed. The game had been slated to debut at the event, but would end up being a no-show. The game would first appear in the public eye in Japan at the following Tokyo Game Show in March of 2001. It was a big year for games. The debut of the Game Boy Advance had occurred only a week before, and many big titles were being promoted, including Metal Gear Solid 2 and Final Fantasy X, which would dominate games coverage at the time. Konami's booth had more games than any other in the convention center, with 70 games total. Silent Hill 2 appears only briefly in Japanese coverage, as a mention beside other titles that appeared at the show. At E3 2001, the game would finally take center stage, when a press event led to multiple K-Set employees appearing to talk about Silent Hill. Kitao Gozo was first, giving a brief overview of the success of the first game before turning the mic over to Imamura, who immediately turned on the game and began to play it on stage. An early version of the Brookhaven level and a brief overview of the plot was revealed before Sato Takayoshi was given the chance to speak on the movie-like quality of their game. On the show floor, Konami's booth was overlooked by a large wall, on top of which were 2 mannequins dressed as the characters James and Laura from the game. The demo that was playable at E3 was very different compared to what would later come to be. In fact, a lot of Silent Hill 2 would change over time. Early screenshots released as part of the PR show a version of Old Neely Street that had a different layout than the final product. It's likely that Brookhaven Hospital was the first area of town the team worked on, or at least the first that was finished. A nearly complete version of the level appears in the earliest available demo from May 2001. A later demo from July would include the first sections of town and the apartment levels, up to the fight with Pyramid Head. There are also unused textures that include writing that refer to a library, perhaps an area that was conceptualized but never developed for the game. Multiple interviews mention having to tweak Silent Hill 2 for quite some time, probably because the team was still learning the PlayStation 2's limitations and how to work with them. There were a lot of things the team wanted to do in the first game that they simply couldn't, and it wasn't a lack of time, but a lack of capability. The PlayStation just couldn't handle the amount of detail they wanted to convey. The PS2, however, was another story. The Emotion Engine was capable of an incredible amount of 3D rendering, where the first game was constantly hiding its map and rendering only small parts. Silent Hill 2 would be capable of loading a much larger stretch of the town at a time, where the first game's buildings and set pieces were often only half-built, hidden in the fog. 2 would be made of far more completed structures. Some would lack fully defined features, but none of them would be as piecemeal as the first game's locations. In fact, the PS2's strengths were also a problem for the team. The clean and modern look went against the older analog style the first game had cultivated, and Imamura Akihiro in particular wanted to keep that kind of atmosphere. In order to emulate it, the team developed a noise filter that would soften the edges of polygons and give the scenes a cinematic feeling. Instead of reusing the layout of the town from the previous game, the team would redesign Silent Hill from the ground up. 10 people would work on the town this time around, but unlike the first game, they wouldn't be handling the inside and outside of town. The rooms would be designed and modeled by another team, leading to a total of 21 designers working on the actual world of Silent Hill 2. Why would the team redesign the town? They already knew they wanted to focus on the story and had spent so much time developing the locale in the previous game. But for the first time, members of the team were able to see the United States more fully. Sato Takayoshi, Imamura Akihiro, and Tsuboyama Masashi are all confirmed as having visited the US at least once, and Sato lived in California at the time. In fact, 4 members of Silent Hill 2's team were living in America, all of them part of Sato Works. They weren't isolated from Japan, however. Sato discusses how they kept contact regularly, and at least once the team from Japan visited those living in the US to tour a real American town. It was difficult at first, as nothing the team saw struck them as suitable. The person living in the US who was leading them around had to run to his apartment, and the team followed, and found it was exactly what they were looking for. One of the most influential locations was a nasty, decrepit bathroom the team found, which would become the inspiration for the first scene of the game, the bathroom at the Overlook, where James first appears in the mirror. This is the first location the design team created. Another Californian locale that would inspire the town is San Bruno, which was close to Redwood City, the location of the American Konami offices at the time. It wasn't more than a half-hour away, and comparing early images of the town and the streets of San Bruno makes it quite obvious. Another Californian location to have a small appearance is Lake Tahoe. A map of the area was used as a placeholder texture on one of the walls of the Historical Society. The goal was to create an authentic American small-town feeling, and part of that involved the usage of long spaces of emptiness. Extended alleyways and hallways increased the sense of isolation, but they also made the town feel more realistic in how sparse it was. Real places have empty, useless locations that are forgotten and abandoned. Silent Hill 2's long winding roads emphasized that isolated feeling. Locations in the town were pulled from real life, though not all of them from the United States. The very first image of the town that's seen from the Overlook is a picture of a real lake. Derwentwater, located in the Lake District National Park of Cumbria, England. The church in the Rebirth ending of the game is also taken from a photo of the San Pedro Church in Avila, Spain. The creation of the town seems to have included the extra areas of town that would later appear in the Xbox version of the game. The PC version of Silent Hill 2 contains Baldwin Mansion and other areas in the code. It's likely they intended these parts of the game to be in the PS2 version originally, and simply ran out of time. The designers who were likely most involved in creating the town were Tsuboyama Masashi, who, like Toyama before him, would both direct and work on design, as well as Ando Takayuki, Koike Tomohisa, and Nemoto Takamitsu, all 3 of whom were previously involved in designing the first game. Koike Tomohisa first worked on graphics for Twin-B RPG, was a background designer in Silent Hill, and for Silent Hill 2 would work on room design. The room in the labyrinth where the player finds Pyramid Head's sword was textured by him, and modeled by Ito Masahiro. This may imply that much or all of the labyrinth's textures were Koike's work. Ando Takayuki was a background designer on Silent Hill. For the sequel, he would work on the town's outer design. At the same time, he was busy working on another title, Shadow of Destiny, working on character expression and motion design. He may have been less involved on Silent Hill 2, or his presence from the start of the project may mean he was more active to begin with, and less so when Shadow of Destiny began. Other designers on the team include Ogura Chieko, the woman who modeled the dog ending room. She would work on character design in Silent Hill 4 and remain at Konami through 2008. Miura Takeshi designed the inside of Neely's bar and may be responsible for the messages on the walls, including, "There was a hole here." He was a student at Tama Art University and would also work on Silent Hill 4. Interestingly, he's since left the games industry and seems to be employed at the Wild Bird Society of Japan, focusing on protecting avian wildlife. Many of the background designers are nearly anonymous. Though I was unable to dig up much about many of these people, they all had a hand in building one of the most popular games of all time. The first artist to join the original Silent Hill team had an uphill battle to wage, a struggle against Japanese culture and tradition. Details behind the scenes are sparse, and the only records to be found come from Sato Takayoshi's own memories of the time, of how his work as an animator was being credited to others, and his fight to earn his rightful place. The problem was twofold: that CG was a new technology that older generations had no experience with, and Japanese hierarchical culture which respects hierarchy and seniority. For Sato, this was a catch-22. He was young and new to the company, but he was the only one capable of doing the work he was doing, and he was teaching many of his older co-workers how to do things he'd painstakingly taught himself over a hellish 5-month period in which he practically lived in the office. For Silent Hill, he fought to be placed on the team, threatening to keep his expertise to himself. His plan worked, but the consequence was doing all the work alone. If he refused to follow hierarchical traditions which would have older employees receiving primary credit, then he would be completely on his own. Sato agreed to the arrangement, leading to a long period of time in which Sato continued a hellish working environment. For 2.5 years, he was working back-breaking hours, sleeping under his desk, and animating every single CGI scene in Silent Hill, doing all the facial animations by hand, a process which took at least 2,000 man-hours. Combined with his early work on the project Sexy Parodius, it would be nearly 3 years of unimaginably long hours and incredibly high levels of pressure. But when Silent Hill ended, that was all behind him. Sato received the Personal CEO Award from Konami's president for his work on the game, as well as a Japanese Cultural Ministry Award, given to those who have made outstanding cultural contributions. He would also win an Excellence Award at the Japan Media Arts Festival in 1998, and his work was selected for screening at the 1999 SIGGRAPH Convention's Electronic Theater. What had begun as an upstart youngster stepping over social boundaries ended with great success and reward for his work. The first game was advertised in part on the beauty and skill of Sato's art, with posters and signs in stores mentioning the award-winning CGI. Sato had done it. He'd proven himself and earned the support of his superiors. For Silent Hill 2, he would have more control and more freedom than he'd had before, and a budget almost twice the size of his previous project. Of the original 4 members of the Silent Hill team, only Sato and Imamura returned for Silent Hill 2, and of those 2, Imamura states in interviews how he felt isolated and removed from the Silent Hill 2 project due to his role as producer. He wasn't as hands-on as he'd been for the first project, having to look at the big picture rather than the details. This means Sato Takayoshi was undoubtedly the original team member with the most influence on Silent Hill 2, and it's clear even without this evidence. His artistic style and worldview are incredibly obvious in the building blocks of the game. A student of philosophy and culture, he draws influence from more than just the world of art and film. Silent Hill 2 would have, for the first time, overt religious references, biblical quotes, references to Adam and Eve, a Jewish protective amulet, and other references to Jewish and Christian tradition are spread throughout. Aztec traditions and their gods also appear. And the history of the town itself seems heavily influenced by the history of Aztec culture. Sato's Silent Hill would be a town built upon water, where the sacrifices of people for the gods was common practice. For Sato, a major part of his hopes for the second game was to fill in the holes in Silent Hill. They hadn't explained much in the first game, and there was little detail to the how and why of the story. Sato wanted to fill in some of these details while leaving the aura of mystery, and so developed more of the town's history and local events. The inclusion of the blood swamp and the history of executions came from his influence. In the first title, Sato created all the CGI on his own. For the sequel, he would be given the chance to lead a team, creating his own studio called FANWORKS. It would include 3 artists, a technician, and Sato himself, and was centered in California, where Sato would live starting in December of 1999. Besides his work on the core concepts of the game and its story, Sato's team would work on the character designs and CGI for Silent Hill 2. It's likely the characters themselves stem from Sato's designs, as the art style for the concept art is his, but the CGI would include the work of all 4 artists of FANWORKS. One of the weaknesses of the original game, Sato felt, was its lack of realism, particularly in relation to the characters. He didn't feel as if he had the skill to properly draw Americans, and wanted to move to the States in order to better study and practice the skill. When he returned isn't clear, but it's likely he spent at least a year or more living in the US while working with the central team via teleconferences. As part of his studies of Western people, it seems Sato drew from life and from Western films. Many of the characters' designs in 2 come from film and actresses. Maria's outfit is a near copy of Christina Aguilera's outfit from her appearance at the Teen Choice Awards in August of 1999, which was before Sato had even left for the US. Laura and Mary favor 2 characters from the film Con Air. James's jacket is a duplicate of Jacob's jacket from the film Jacob's Ladder, and Angela's character heavily resembles Sandra Bullock's character in The Net, who also happened to be named Angela. This would, in fact, be the source of her name, which had both religious symbolism, as the name means angel in Spanish, and the sense of being the name of an immigrant because of said origin, and the team liked the associations of both. To begin, the team would have to establish what their new technology was capable of. The software they would use does not seem to have changed from Soft Image 3D, but the PlayStation 2's capabilities were certainly different. In order to work out the limitations of the system, the team created a short demonstration of their CG on the PS2 by recreating Sybil Bennett's entrance from Silent Hill 1 on the PS2 engine. Work on their central project would begin from there. Sato would place a heavy emphasis on imperfections in his designs, on creating a sense of humanity in these figures, as well as something uncomfortable in their appearance. Maria would have a roll of fat on her belly and the roots of her hair were fading into their original color. For Angela, the goal was to make the way her face moved come across as uncomfortable and unsettling. Eddie has a similar stylization in the eyes, as his gaze moves much faster than anyone else's. Besides Sato, the artist whose work is best documented is Michael Miller. He received a bachelor's in mathematics from Linfield College, working in the field of construction for some time before returning to school to study animation. He received certification in soft image as well as a scholarship for outstanding student performance at the Vancouver Film School in Canada. Miller began working with Konami in 2000, and his first work in the games industry would be for Silent Hill 2. He's listed as working on character design and CGI, as are all the members of FANWORKS, but his resume better details his actual contributions. Michael Miller would work on the game's facial animations, lighting and rigging for CG cutscenes, the layout of the camera during these scenes, cleaning up the motion capture used to create them, and finally rendering them. According to Miller, the most difficult work was the facial features, which would include a great amount of detail. Miller would be behind major elements of the facial animations for Angela, Eddie, and James. This would include all the morph targets for these three, a term that refers to the vertices present on a model. Using this mesh, an animator can move the expression of the character by storing each expression as a keyframe, which then shifts as the image changes between one keyframe to another. In other words, Miller was behind the way Eddie, Angela, and James's faces move in CGI cutscenes. In addition, he was behind the lip sync for all three of them, meaning that he matched the movement of the characters' lips to the words they were saying. Using a program called Magpie Pro, Miller would block the lip sync before importing it to Soft Image. Overall, he would work on blocking 37 pieces of dialogue across 12 scenes, and this includes elements of the scenes which aren't actually viewed in the game. Miller's YouTube account, which contains pieces of his past work, has a video from Silent Hill 2 which shows the cutscenes of the game from new angles. This reveals the entire scene is animated, even when the camera isn't looking at them. In addition to this character work, Miller was behind all the CGI pre-rendered water, cloud, and fog effects, and the camera setup for the swinging lamp and the bed that appears in the game's opening. In addition, he created over 20 pieces of marketing and promotional art, which may mean Miller was behind all the advertisements for the game, at the very least in the West. One quote seems to imply his work on Silent Hill 2 would take him about 6 months. Ninomiya Kazuhiko would also be a part of Sato Works. His career began in 1998 working on costume design for Rakuga Kids, before moving to enemy design for Castlevania. His specific work on Silent Hill 2 is unclear, but his Facebook account has many examples of his later art. He appears to favor clay work and monstrous creatures. He seems to have stayed at Konami through at least 2015. The last artist was Kurita Yukito, who studied at Tokyo Zokei University until 1993, and later returned to school to receive a Master's in Fine Art from the Pratt Institute in 2000. From there, he joined Konami, where he remains to this day. The technician Sato mentions is likely Kishida Morio, who is credited as the CGI movie editor for Silent Hill 2. It's a role he would reprise for Silent Hill 3, while also working on publicity for Silent Hill 4. He'd also work on minor elements of other games around that time, including video editing and dev support for DDR Max 2 and marketing for Contra Shattered Soldier. The monsters of the first Silent Hill came from the team efforts of Toyama Keiichiro, Sato Naoko, and a new hire to Konami, Ito Masahiro, one of Silent Hill's most famous creators. For Silent Hill 2, he would take on a leadership role as art director of the game. At least 28 employees worked beneath him in the design and modeling departments, while others may have been involved in peripheral roles. But when it came to monster design, only one person would be involved, and that was Ito. Not only were the original concepts his, but he was also the sole modeler of the creatures, meaning that every movement and every moment of the game that features the monsters is his work. When it came to designing monsters for Silent Hill 2, Ito knew he wanted to make them more horrifying. The first game's monsters featured large bugs, dinosaurs, and semi-distorted human beings, but they were rather simple in design. Ito wanted to approach the monsters with a cohesive theme meant to make them more terrifying: distorted humanity. To Ito, monsters are more frightening when there is something human about them, creating an illusion or a sensation of wrongness at the sight of them. From a distance, you might mistake the creature as a person, only to be unpleasantly surprised. Or you might wonder if this almost human thing began its life as a person like you, and if a similar fate might befall you. Ito designed all the monsters with a human aspect that he then undermined with strange motions and impossible angles to their bodies. Starting with that idea, the team agreed on a visual theme for the monsters: soured flesh. They also quickly realized they would need a chaser monster to go with their story, a monster who would represent an obstacle and a threat to the main character. So Ito began designing his first creature for Silent Hill 2, the most famous monster he would ever make. A creature he would call Red Pyramid Thing. The starting point for his creature was a hidden face. Following a trend he began in art school, designing inhuman creatures with masked or imprisoned heads. The very first design he created was a basic version of the idea, a human shape with a bag tied to the head, but the silhouette was too simple, so Ito decided to go further. The eventual design focused on a creature in white gloves and a butcher's smock, wearing a triangular helmet, with sharp edges inspired by the hull of the German King Tiger tank. It was the evolution of a painting from his school days, of a large metal triangle with humanoid limbs. Pyramid Head is the perfect monster, yet the design is so simple: a man's body and a triangle-shaped head. It works so well because of the way it incorporates psychology with art design. Certain shapes are perceived by the eye in certain ways. Round, soft edges are friendly, but sharp edges are dangerous, unfriendly. Pyramid Head appears human, but the triangle head has no resemblance to humanity, and it comes across as threatening and painful to its wearer. It invites questions which people are still asking to this day, which Ito refuses to answer. Without a head or eyes, it's hard to judge what a person is thinking or feeling. It feels wrong to be missing such vital elements of humanity, and it leaves us unsettled. These aspects are what are at play in Pyramid Head's character, and why he is such a long-lasting and beloved aspect of the series. But the scenes he is part of are just as much a part of his lasting influence. Ito Masahiro blends his fantastic design with powerful artistic metaphors that make use of classic Western films. In 1986, the American director and writer David Lynch released the film Blue Velvet, a violent, sexual, controversial thriller starring Kyle MacLachlan, centered upon a criminal conspiracy that finds the young protagonist becoming entangled in the life of a beautiful lounge singer. The pivotal scene of the film involves the protagonist, Jeffrey, sneaking into the singer Dorothy's apartment. The woman finds him hiding and forces him to undress in revenge. But the scene changes quickly when the antagonist and local drug lord, Dorothy's pimp, arrives. Jeffrey hides in a closet and watches as Dorothy is physically and sexually assaulted by her boss, the man who is holding her family hostage to control her. The film explores the tragic associations between violence and sex in the darkness of the criminal underworld, in which blackmail, sexual slavery, sadomasochism, and humiliation are all part and parcel of intimacy. The unhealthy relationship between the two and their helplessness at the hands of the gangsters they're controlled by is a means by which to depict how sex itself can be a violent act and a means of control, how sorrow and grief can lead the abused to desire the very person that's hurting them. It is a twisted, uncomfortable film, and the scene in Silent Hill 2 is almost a moment-by-moment replay of the scene in the closet from early in the film. It's not the only Lynch film that's possibly being referenced here. A less obvious reference may be to another of his more controversial, violent, and sexual films, Fire Walk With Me, a film prequel to his television series Twin Peaks, a surreal mystery focused upon the murder of a young girl named Laura Palmer. The film is set before Laura's death, depicting her final days and what led to her demise. The girl suffers physical and psychological torment at the hands of an otherworldly spirit. She suffers sexual and physical assault at the hands of many, including her own father, before her eventual death. A central part of the film is a gift Laura receives of a framed photo of an open doorway. She visits the picture in her dreams, traveling through door after door. The more surreal, otherworldly aspects of the story come into play as she travels into another world. and eventually finds herself in the Black Lodge after her death. It is incredibly strange and filled with complex meaning, which fans are still discussing to this day, but the picture is undoubtedly tied to Laura's suffering and her eventual death. In the picture, a room is visible with ornate, flowery wallpaper, and when it's compared with the wallpaper from the apartment room where James sees a corpse in front of a TV, it is incredibly similar. Blue Velvet and Fire Walk With Me both depict young women trapped in desperate circumstances, abused by men who have power over them. Standing in the closet, James takes on the role of McLaughlin in Blue Velvet, the well-intentioned voyeur who is unable to resist becoming part of Dorothy's twisted, violent sexual life. In the West, Pyramid Head's behavior has long been described as assault, something Ito does not agree with. He admits to having had sexual imagery in mind for the scene, but depicting Pyramid Head as a representation of James's sexual repression was never his intention. In fact, it seems to have been a major concern behind the scenes to avoid the implications of assault. An animation of Pyramid Head picking up a nurse and walking away with her was removed because it was feared it would imply assault. The forbidden poster of Silent Hill 2 was similarly removed from public stores for the same reason. In Fire Walk With Me, the concept of the Black Lodge is another reality which embodies all that is evil within the world. Each person has a doppelganger, a dark self that exists within the lodge and must be faced and overcome to escape this other world. Silent Hill has its own other world, and James is in a Black Lodge of his own, trying to overcome his double. The sword Pyramid Head uses connects the two of them. Pyramid Head's sword is designed to resemble one piece of a broken pair of scissors. The other piece is the sword James can find and wield in the labyrinth, implying the two of them are pieces of a singular whole. Pyramid Head embodies his dark side. That is why it later chases him, leading him towards the truth, and why it destroys itself in the end. Ito Masahiro even describes Pyramid Head as the angel on James's shoulder, and the other monsters as his devils. The incredibly potent scene in the apartments references a third film, one that Ito is well known for being a fan of, Jacob's Ladder. During the scene in which Pyramid Head approaches the closet, you can see a long tongue appearing from beneath a bend in the helmet. The impossibility of metal bending so easily, and the incredibly long tongue, was meant to hint that this was all a delusion, something only James could see, much like the film Jacob's Ladder, a film about a man in the throes of death, hallucinating nightmarish things as he goes about his life. The film discusses how the mind can invent terrible things to try and avoid painful realities, and Pyramid Head is a similar type of delusion in Silent Hill 2. In a tweet, Ito comments that without the film, the game would not exist as it is now, and that the idea of James being chased by a devil who was tearing his life away informed the character's creation. Early versions of the story imagined Pyramid Head as a creature who appeared in James's dreams, and there were going to be multiple versions of the creature appearing throughout the game. In fact, many details of Pyramid Head had to be cut as development went forward. They originally wanted to have unscripted, sudden appearances of the creature, creating the fear it might appear at any time. Early footage of the game shows Pyramid Head appearing in locations he never comes to in the final version. There were also interactions with the monster's helmet during cinematics that had to be cut. The valves on its head were originally meant for use in a specific scene, possibly a boss fight that never came to be. There were other hints at the delusion that didn't work out as intended. Originally, seeing the painting of Pyramid Head with a spear at the museum would change the monster's weapon to a spear, indicating that James could influence the creature's appearance. Unfortunately, the hallway in the hospital basement turned out to be too narrow for his sword, which meant the spear had to appear earlier than intended. It would take a total of 5 weeks to finish work on Pyramid Head, a week to design the concept, 2 to finish modeling, texturing, and rigging the creature, another 2 to finish keyframe animations, all of which was likely done in early 2001. Animating for the game would take the longest time. The scene of Pyramid Head assaulting the mannequins took a whole day to keyframe by itself. The characters' movements would be captured via mocap, but they didn't have the budget to mocap the monsters as well, which meant Ito had to do all the animations by hand. Every monstrous movement was Ito's work. He would also animate Mira from the dog ending. Pyramid Head was the first design he began, but not the last. Ito would design all the creatures that would relate to James and his journey through Silent Hill. In total, there would be 9 of them, one for each of the red squares that appear near the end of the game. Fleshlip, a box-shaped monster in a cage with a grotesque mouth, represented the mouth to abuse him, referring to James and Mary's relationship late in her life. Early sketches were similar in design to the final monster, though instead of a large mouth, there were strange protuberances across its skin. The cages themselves were inspired by a Japanese artist, Noguchi Isamu, whose death-lynched figure features a statue in a similar cage, as well as Joel Peter Whitkin's Man with No Legs, a photograph which appears in the film Jacob's Ladder. The lying figure design came to Ito while watching a co-worker walk down the hall wearing a hoodie, with his hands in his pockets, resembling an armless creature. He also took influence from the motions of drunk people and young children, unsteady and stumbling. The earliest sketches involved designs heavily focused on legs, with sculpted muscles and high heels built into their feet, and a long tongue lolling out of a mouth on a featureless face. Later concepts pulled on BDSM inspirations with tall red high heel boots and fabric that covered the whole head and torso, but neither of these would get past the early concept phase. Early rendered versions of the monster used the arms fused to the torso, but included distorted mouths on a swollen face. Their posture in the beta image implies more hunched movement, while the final figure lurches with its shoulders thrown back. The poison the creature spews calls to mind Mary's verbal abuses. The Mandarin, the creature which hangs from bulbous mouths beneath the floor of Silent Hill, represents overwhelming, incomprehensible anguish and helplessness. The ends of their arms have distorted mouths that cling to the grated floors, and black tongues that can attack James. In the Japanese novelization, they're described as originating from a desire to escape. The monster's Japanese name refers to a political figure, and Mandarin, a word meaning bureaucrat or public official, is a close approximation of the meaning. The abstract daddy, the distorted shape of 2 figures on a bed-like object, is actually a monster of James, according to Ito. Angela sees the creature too, and in her story it represents her father's abuse, but the version we see is inspired by James's issues rather than hers. Ito describes the creature as representing Mary on bed rest, and that the version Angela sees, only Angela knows. The creature may have originally only been meant to appear in the first scene. When asked why it appears in the hotel as well, Ito says, "Because it's the game." The mannequins were apparently creatures inspired by monsters from Japanese folklore, though Ito doesn't specify what. He might be referring to the Ashinaga Tenaga, or literally long legs, long arms, a pair of yokai in Japanese folklore with extremely long, distorted limbs. Silent Hill 2 would have its own variations of the nurse monster, but they had little in common with Sato's nurses. Instead of being infested with parasites, they're monstrous humans with distorted faces, some with baby faces, representing Mary and James and the child they never had. Some had spikes and metal going into their faces, a variation Ito apparently created late in production. Other nurse creatures have a red square on their mouth, which Ito says relates to the 9 red squares. The vibrating head motions, also programmed by Ito, were meant to represent Mary struggling. Apparently, the nurses and Mary are about the same height, according to Ito, implying a deep connection between the two. Originally, these creatures would have bulbous faces with thin skin like a condom that would pop like a balloon when shot, but it just wasn't feasible. In addition, their primary weapon would be an IV stand with a bag of blood, which may not have been feasible either. The steel pipe and gun became the nurses' mainstays, with the pipe as a reference to Silent Hill 1's Harry Mason. The inspirations for them came from The Exorcist III, Jacob's Ladder, and BDSM fashion. The final monster is Maria herself, who becomes the final boss in many of the game's endings. She hangs upside down inside a metal box-like frame, similar to the Fleshlips with dirty, soured flesh. Her outfit takes inspiration from a nun's uniform, particularly around the head. According to Ito, the Creeper is not included among his 9 red square monsters, and was instead designed as a reference to the first game. The final monster of the 9 is likely the Prisoner, the invisible monster that appears inside Toluca Prison. The original concept for Pyramid Head wasn't popular with the team and the higher-ups behind Silent Hill 2. Ito Masahiro had to fight for the monster's inclusion, because it was seen as too different and avant-garde to appeal to Japanese audiences. The reaction to Silent Hill 2 in Japan was incredibly negative to begin with, and there was a time in which Pyramid Head's design was attacked online. But it wasn't too long before he became a fan favorite, often referred to as Sankaku-san, or Mr. Triangle, or referenced with a triangle-shaped emoji. In fact, Japanese fans came to love him so much they wanted him back. Western fans eventually saw him as essential to James and Silent Hill 2, an interpretation that Ito agrees with. While he draws many helmeted creatures, including variations of Pyramid Head and a white one called the White Hunter, he seems to feel that there is a unique creature that belongs to James. One of his tweets clarifies his artworks as depicting a different creature. That's just Pyramid Head, not Red Pyramid Thing. When Silent Hill Origins was released, it came out in the West first, and Japanese chat rooms relied upon fans who bought and played the English version to give them details about the game. There were a lot of questions about whether Pyramid Head was in the title. In fact, Japanese fans wanted him back in everything. It seems this may be the origin of Konami's desire to include him in more media. Ito himself admits in a tweet that a new Silent Hill would likely not be approved by Konami Corporate without the creature, because he was considered essential to the game's success. In a more recent tweet, Ito publicly lamented creating fucking Pyramid Head, which became a popular talking point in games media and shocking to many of his fans. But considering fan culture, it's obvious why, at times, irritation at the creature might overwhelm Ito's admiration. It's clear he still loves the monster. He still draws him often, and sometimes doodles cute cartoons of him and takes pictures of his figure. But like a double-edged sword, Pyramid Head has also become the albatross around his neck, defining his career and becoming the only thing many fans ever try to talk to him about. It's a sad side effect of fan culture and fame on the internet, to have all his creativity and history wrapped up in one creation from 20 years ago. His art and designs are incredibly creative, haunting, and unforgettable, and hopefully we'll see them in another game soon to come. The first Silent Hill was translated somewhat unofficially. Toyama Keiichiro wrote the scenario, while Inaba Heri Haruhiko translated the script and directed the voice actors, and an outside company called the Latina International Corporation was given official credit for the script translation. While translation for global markets had become a greater concern in recent years, it was still not a major priority at the end of the 1990s. Instead of hiring translators, an employee who already worked for Konami would find his way onto the Silent Hill 2 team, Jeremy Blostein. He'd worked on various translation projects for a few years by then, but would find himself in a unique position on Silent Hill 2. Instead of working alone on the translation, he was brought into the inner fold and became a major part of the game's development. Jeremy Blostein was born in 1966 in Long Island, New York, as one of 5 children, at least 3 of whom would one day work in video games and Japanese media. He grew up playing video games from a young age, and as a young man became involved in the industry. He got his start working for Jaleco in Chicago in 1990 as an associate producer. It was a short-lived position, however. After only 3 months, he was fired for insubordination for having argued with his boss. It would be another 3 years before he worked in the games industry. In the early 90s, he moved to Japan and spent a year teaching English, but he hadn't let go of his desire to work in games. His twin brother was working at Konami in Chicago at the time and helped arrange an interview for him in Tokyo. He got the job and was hired to the International Business Department in 1993. His job consisted of coordinating with international branches on the global releases of games, and as the only native English speaker, he was often part of writing the English text for games like Sparkster and Snatcher. Snatcher released in Japan in 1988, but wouldn't go west until 95. Blostein spent 2 to 3 months working as a reviewer and editor of the game's script, while the translation was done by someone else. Still, he wasn't as involved in the making of games as he wanted to be. He'd also recently started a family and wanted to return home to the US to spend more time with his daughter. To achieve both, he made the decision to go freelance as a translator. It wasn't an easy start. For the first few years, work was hard to get, and he wound up translating more technical works like patents and legal and medical documents. Another of his early projects was Contra Hardcore, which he credits as his first translation and voiceover direction job. From there, he would have his hands in translating some of the most famous and popular games of the era, working on titles like Metal Gear Solid, Dragon Quest, Suikoden, Castlevania, and later series like Valkyrie Profile and Shadow Hearts. Translation at the time was far from what it is today. There was no internet, no Google to search for terms or references. Blostein had to buy kanji dictionaries and reference texts on topics he needed, depending on the project. Military novels for Metal Gear, Japanese culture and myths for games like Dragon Quest. He was often the only translator, working on huge projects that today would be handled by a team. The first Metal Gear Solid would take 6 months to translate, and would find Blostein overseeing the voice direction without an official credit. Many of the game's more famous militaristic terms, like the codec, originated in Blostein's translations. Even after moving to working freelance, Blostein still had strong ties with Konami, which is likely how he came to be involved in Silent Hill 2. He was living in Massachusetts at the time and was asked to join the project. His first meetings involved discussions of acceptable content before official production had begun, while Owaku was still throwing around ideas for the story. This team he worked with was about 4 or 5 guys, including Owaku and Tsuboyama. Blostein was brought in to discuss with the team what themes would be acceptable to American audiences. The team wanted to make a game that was darker and more violent, and thus it was decided to aim for an overseas market, where such themes were more common. Blostein was their go-to guy for discussing what would frighten Americans, what would be deemed too much or unacceptable. Working on translating the script involved nearly daily conversations with Owaku Hiroyuki, the scenario writer. They would read each other's work and discuss it, asking questions and debating ideas while editing both the Japanese and English versions of the story. At times, Owaku even altered his language to follow Blostein's recommendations. As the story was developed, Blostein worked alongside the team to create the world of the game. He would translate the entirety of the script, including riddles and puzzles, as well as come up with many of the characters' names. Sunderland was a place name he chose for its thematic meaning, divided land, which fit James's mindset. Orozco was the name of a relief pitcher from the New York Mets, while Dombrowski was the name of a person he'd once known that he didn't get on with. There really wasn't anything that he censored in the script or during production. There were certainly things they discussed that would have been forbidden or taboo, like dead babies and incest, which would not be explicitly mentioned or discussed in the game. Of course, some of these themes were hinted at. Angela's backstory was established early on, and Blostein confirms that her dark history was discussed by the team and intended to be understood as a history of assault and incest. The idea of including such a dark past in one of the characters' backstories went as far back as pre-script writing meetings early on. Together with some associates, including Harry Inaba, Blostein would form a company called Wordbox, which would handle all the casting and hiring of voice actors for Silent Hill 2. Actors were called in from across Tokyo. The call for a young girl to play a role would lead to 2 men bringing their daughters to the auditions. Guy Seehee, a businessman born in New York, and David Schaufler, an established voice actor since before 1990. Both of them brought their daughters to audition for Laura, but ended up auditioning for roles themselves. Sihi would be cast as James Sunderland, while Shafla would be cast as Eddie. The young girl chosen to play Laura would be Jacqueline Breckenridge. She was around 10 or 11 at the time, living in Japan with her family and participating in voice work and acting on TV. She remembers introducing herself and being approached by Blaustein, who asked her to jump on his back and scream, "I hate you." She read some more lines, and that was that. The role of Laura was hers. It was a lot of fun in her words, and the darker elements of the story were kept from her. She would be given exact directions of what actions to do, but not always why she was doing them. She had no idea she was locking James inside a room with a monster during the scene in Brookhaven. She was just told to lock someone in a closet and run away laughing. It would often cover up what she was doing with innocent or G-rated explanations that weren't exactly right. She remembers being shocked at the idea she was supposed to call someone a gutless fatso and was afraid her mother would find out. David Shuffla was a dramatic person from a young age. He performed in school plays, volunteered at the local theater and TV stations. Moving to Japan, he began doing radio for the NHK around 1990. He started dubbing over movies and animations and did a handful of video game roles. None would take off like Silent Hill 2. His daughter had heard of the audition through a friend at school. Once they were there, he was asked to audition, and he thought it would be fun to work with his daughter. He had no time to prepare, so he winged it. Shuffla thinks he landed the role because of his skill with vomiting. Having spent a long time traveling around rural areas on the Asian continent, he was made ill from food poisoning quite a bit and had a lot of practice getting sick. Guy Sihi studied industrial design in school and has worked in various business fields in the USA and Japan. He too brought his daughter to the audition, and when he was asked to audition and received the role while she didn't, he was sure to ask her permission before accepting the gig. It was an interesting experience. All the actors were present during the mocap scenes, performing and interacting together, which created a unique intimacy and heightened tension in the scenes. The director told him it was the first time synchronized mocap had been done for such a large-scale production. Recording the voices took 4 days. Recording the stage performances, 4 months. Several days were set aside solely for recording Sihi walking, running, hitting, being hit, and of course, dying. For Sihi, the role of James was incredibly powerful. He'd recently been struggling with a divorce, and the feelings of loss and sorrow related to marriage hit close to home. He also struggled with a specific scene, an ending in which James picks up his wife Mary and walks away with her. Sihi had a hard time picking up Mary's actress, taking multiple tries before he finally got it right. The actress who would play Angela was Donna Burke, an Australian-born woman who was formerly an English teacher. Eventually, she decided to pursue her dream of singing and voice acting, and moved to Japan in 1996 to teach English. She'd had a decade of training in voice lessons, and would go on to do announcements and commercials, as well as roles in anime and video games. But her first major gaming role would be Angela. The actress who would play Maria and Mary was Monica Taylor Horgan, a voice actress who spent 4.5 years living in Tokyo as a voice actor, model, and mocap actor before returning to London. She found Maria to be the easier character to play, calling her a vamp that's a lot of fun. Mary was harder because of her fragility, yet Horgan managed to capture the letter-reading scene from the end of the game in a single take. The entire cast and crew were silent during the powerful scene, with many of them misty-eyed. Horgan broke into tears afterwards. She was soon leaving Japan and was emotional about leaving everything behind. Childhood memories of losing her mother to reach the emotional depths of Mary's pain. The dev team was rather open-minded when it came to working with the voice actors. It was a collaborative effort, with the devs open to allowing the voice actors to go with an idea if it was working, and they would often applaud for actors after intense scenes. The voice actors themselves didn't know the whole story as they worked. The ending in particular was kept secret, and the whole script wasn't made available early on. Months would pass between pre-production and casting and the motion capture sessions. When it came time to work on mocap, Blaustein would fly out to help direct for a few weeks. He wasn't present for work that required no acting, like the capture of James's various movements, but was present for every major cutscene and performance. He even participated in a scene, taking the role of James in the stairway scene with Angela. It had been his suggestion to perform the motion capture first before the voice acting, which wasn't traditional at the time. This way, they could later refer to the recordings during voice acting sessions and the creation of animations and cutscenes. Blaustein tended to focus on the smaller elements of the scene and the vocal performance, while others were focused on the broad movements of the scene. One of these people was Harry Inaba, working alongside Blaustein, who was a longtime friend. They'd worked together on various projects since 1993. Inaba would take a step back on translations for the sequel and focus on directing the mocap, which was an ambitious venture, as Silent Hill 2's mocap was far more involved than was typical at the time. He's officially listed as the casting coordinator, though his tweets imply he was also very hands-on directing the scenes themselves. The outside company working on the mocap was Lynx DigiWorks, at the time a recently formed company created by the union of an animation studio and a mocap production company. The idea was to unify the branches of creating animated film and gaming cutscenes, and in April 2001, the company opened a brand new mocap studio, which may be where Silent Hill 2 was captured. They would go on to work on Silent Hill 3 and 4. Later, they worked on Metal Gear Solid 2, Resident Evil on the GameCube, and Devil May Cry 2, 3, and 4. The company seems to have been active until 2008, and it has since gone dark. As for the voice acting, Blaustein was present for all of it, too. He says the strange whisper fans have long attempted to understand is really just gibberish, what the Japanese might call butsu butsu or hitori goto. The actor was just talking nonsense to himself in a whisper, which was then edited into a loop by the audio team. The people working on the actual animation included drama director Murakoshi Suguru, a new hire to Konami whose first project seems to have been Silent Hill 2. He's from Saitama and studied graphic design at Tama Art University, graduating in March of 1999. For the previous Silent Hill, much of the game's major scenes would be animated in full CG to make them stand out. But the better capabilities of the PS2 meant it was capable of far better animation outside of CG. While there would still be about 10 minutes of full CG cutscenes, there would be an additional 30 minutes of in-game animated scenes using the base character models. These models were created by Yuri Shingo, Sugawara Sachiko, and Asano Minako. Yuri was born in 1970 and worked on Hyper Olympics before joining the Silent Hill 2 team, while Sugawara and Asano were both new to the industry. They would split the cast between them. Yuri would create the models for James and Mary, as well as working on all the in-game facial animations. Sugawara would create Angela and Laura. Asano would create Maria, and drama director Murakoshi himself would model Eddie. The drama animations using these models would be created by another team, which included 4 more animators. Kanemori Shiro was likely very new to the games industry. He may have started at Sega working on Skies of Arcadia animating village characters before coming to Konami around November of 2000. Sakamoto Atsushi was also relatively new, with Silent Hill 2 and Shadow of Destiny both listed as his first projects. He was working on both at the same time, but had a greater workload on Shadow of Destiny, where he was behind character expression and motion design. He wasn't the only one. Matsumura Rei had the exact same job split, also working on Shadow of Destiny's characters and motions, while Tanaka Atsuya would only work on motion for Shadow of Destiny. They comprised the drama animation team for Silent Hill 2. Animation work also included character motion outside of game scenes. Animating the appearance of how characters moved and interacted with the world would fall to the character motion animators, a team of 3 consisting of Kobayashi Yuichi, Kobayashi Shigeru, and Nakazawa Kazuhide. Kobayashi Yuichi, listed first among the 3, seems to have had the longest Konami career at the time, starting in 1994 with graphic design on Snatcher. His Konami credits continue until around 2010. Kobayashi Shigeru worked on International Track and Field in '96, Nagano Winter Olympics in '97, and International Track and Field 2000 in '99 as the main designer. His credits end in 2003 with Castlevania Lament of Innocence. The last of the 3 would be far more influential further down the line. Nakazawa Kazuhide would later become director of Silent Hill 3. His career at Konami started around '98 with Kensei's Sacred Fist, designing the character model for Yugo. His name appears on a Konami patent at the time relating to moving image generation via character skeletons. Alongside his Silent Hill 2 work, he would also act as a character designer for Shadow of Destiny. He seems to have worked in close concert with Mizuochi Yuki, the programmer behind the character programming which would bring the character animator's works to life. 2 patents filed in September of 2002 have Mizuochi and Nakazawa's names on them and relate to character motion. One is a game device for executing a game process relating to a game character holding an attack means. It seems to be a system aimed at allowing the player to better control their aim during an attack. The other, also related to player attacks, is for easily inputting the movement direction and the attack direction of a game character. In the midst of the game's development, a second Silent Hill 2 project began. In public, it wasn't known as that, however. For a while, it was called Silent Hill X, and what exactly the game would be was unclear. Interviews made it pretty clear early on it was a port of Silent Hill 2, but not every media site or magazine seemed to get the memo. The PS2 released in March of 2000, and after the fall of the Sega Dreamcast, it was the only console on the market. That wouldn't last for long, however, and by November of 2001, Microsoft would enter the console world with the first Xbox. Silent Hill X was planned as an Xbox exclusive to be released alongside the console. While that would happen in Japan, where both released in February of 2002, they wouldn't quite manage it in the West. The console released in November, but the game wouldn't hit the market until a month later. The project would involve converting the already existing programming and resources of the PS2 version to the Xbox console, finishing development of the resources for the new scenario born from a wish, and cleaning up resources from the old game. Many team members of the Restless Dreams version are credited with background revision, including members of the original Silent Hill 2 team, such as Fujishima Yumiko, Ando Takayuki, Fujiki Masayuki, and a new team member, Yamaguchi Kyohei. It seems like most of the work, however, was centered on programming. To make the game work on a new console, the programmers would have to essentially rewrite it. The work would include the director of the project, Kobayashi Takayuki, a longtime Konami employee since at least 1996. In 2001, he would also work on Shadow of Destiny, and would go on to work on multiple Suikoden games. Komuta Osamu would work on peripheral programming for Silent Hill 2 Restless Dreams. It would seem to be the start of his career, at least in the West, but he would go on to have major roles on multiple Konami titles, and he would also work on programming for Shadow of Destiny. His work on Silent Hill 2, in his own words, was hell, but it was fun. Distant eyes. He would remain at Konami until at least 2012. Hiyura Makoto worked on sound programming for Restless Dreams, and was also a returning employee from the original team. For the first project, he worked on tool programming, the system developers use to interact with and build the game. This toolset may have become a staple of this series going forward. He would return to work on sound programming and the camera for Silent Hill 3, and would receive special thanks for Silent Hill 4. It seems he then moved to Atlus around 2009 and would eventually work as a programmer on the Persona series. There's very little detail about the making of the updated version of the game, besides the fact that it was delayed, that making it was hell, and it was made at least partially alongside the original project. The first Silent Hill was the beginning of a long career alongside the horror franchise for Yamaoka Akira, and for Silent Hill 2, he would continue to refine his horrifying sounds. According to Jeremy Blostein, Yamaoka wasn't as involved in 2 as he would later be in 3. Blostein says he worked in a different building from the main team. The soundtrack for Silent Hill 2 is entirely instrumental, save for a singular song, The Reverse Will, one of the ending themes, whose lyrics can only be understood when the song is played in reverse. A reference to the ending it appears in the rebirth ending, which reverses Mary's fate. The word for the terms rebirth and reverse are actually the same in Japanese. The song is a prayer, "Now I lay me down to sleep," and was sung by the young actress who played Laura, Jacqueline Breckenridge. The most famous song from the game, Theme of Laura, was written in 3 days, combining a sad melody with a strong beat as a way to evoke emotions. In many ways, that concept embodies the entire game, creating a powerful atmosphere of sorrow and intensity. The music of the game ties deeply into the themes and symbols of the story as a whole. For instance, the theme Magdalene, the song which plays after Maria's death in the hospital, is a likely reference to Mary Magdalene, the woman who first discovered Jesus' resurrection, who also shares a name with James's wife. Another religious reference related to Mary and Maria comes from Love Psalm, the ending theme for Born from a Wish. The name comes from the Book of Psalms, a collection of religious hymns in the Jewish Torah, and the word is a derivative of the Greek for instrumental music. As well as the soundtrack, Yamaoka was once again in charge of sound effects, creating 50 different effects for the game. One sound specifically, the footsteps, would have 200 variations, a choice related to how often the player would be left in the silence, listening to their own footsteps in the dark. Yamaoka wanted to surprise the player and create an unsettling environment, continuing his trend from the first game of blending silence with sudden and powerful sound. For this game, he would go further, using sounds which are too quiet for the human ear to catch, creating a silence that wasn't actually silent at all. The radio was also returning for the game, and the new sound capabilities of the PS2 and the S-Force library meant that these sound effects, and the radio especially, had far higher quality sounds than they had before. His goal was to make the audience feel something listening to his music, to challenge their imagination, to create sounds that felt as if they were truly under your skin. In other words, to create a real physical reaction in the listener while they played the game. Other games like Resident Evil created sounds that were rather typical, in Yamaoka's opinion. He wanted to create something that audiences weren't used to hearing. Apprehension and unease were the ultimate goal of the soundtrack for Silent Hill 2. The month of July is the hottest time of year in Chantilly, an area near the suburbs of Paris, France. Still, it's rather comfortable, as the summers there are short and cloudy, and rarely do the temperatures go into the 80s. It was likely a relatively nice day that July in 2001, when more than 100 journalists from across Europe found themselves in a random field near Chantilly. Each of them had received a letter inviting them to come meet a horde of nurses that awaited them in Paris, France. It apparently read, "Silent Hill, our sanctuary of memories. I'll be waiting for you there." These journalists were from Germany, France, the UK, Spain, and elsewhere, and all of them were equally confused that day when a crowd of blood-stained nurses gathered round and started arranging them all together. It was the beginning of a very strange, very memorable event, organized by Konami of Europe to promote Silent Hill 2, which was releasing in fall of that year. The journalists were rounded up by a few dozen nurses, all dressed in white blood-stained uniforms, pumped up and excited as they began to gather the crowd together. Apparently they were howling and shouting about how the group was going to save Mary. The journalists were told nothing and could only follow along, as the nurses then guided them to a fleet of armed soldiers in military vehicles that had arrived on the scene. So begins the kidnapping, not only of the journalists, but of 3 members of the Silent Hill 2 team that were present: Sado Takayoshi, Imamura Akihiro, and Yamaoka Akira. The 3 developers had their heads covered with black bags and were told to swallow red pills in an almost ceremonial fashion before being bundled into a vehicle. The journalists were next. There weren't enough vehicles to shepherd everyone at once, leading to Sado taking a seat in the back of a car alongside journalists, apparently laughing as they went. It took hours to transport everyone to the second location, even though it was only a short drive away. Awaiting them in the forests outside Paris was a haunted mansion surrounded by armed soldiers who only had paintball guns and haunting decor. The soldiers wore masks and some had dogs, lining the woods as if they were keeping the journalists from running away. Inside the mansion, nurses guided everyone through the haunted rooms where corpses hung from the ceiling, dark silhouettes loomed, with creepy lighting and sound effects playing throughout. The group was gathered into a conference room, where the first real business of the day began. This was short-lived, however. After the first conference, the nurses led them deeper into the mansion, down to the basement, where a second conference began. This ended with a video of content from the game, which was followed by applause. However, the event still wasn't done. The journalists found themselves arranged into groups of 12 by the bloody nurses and given a flashlight in preparation to explore the house. First, however, each person had to go through a medical examination. The nurses would take people one at a time behind a white sheet where they were made to drink blood. Finally, they were brought to the starting point of their exploration, where Maria awaited them. She informed the groups that she was real, and then instructed them in the rules of the game. While exploring the house, they were to find 2 lights. The dark mansion was incredibly well decorated, resembling a Halloween haunted house attraction. Eventually, the groups were gathered again and brought outside, led to another shed in the woods where a young girl stood in the yard next to a corpse hanging from a tree. This was where everyone was given a weapon, a paintball gun. The last stage of the event was a paintball game in the woods with the soldiers, nurses, and even the members of the dev team. This incredible, absolutely wild event, which even on paper seems more like a strange amalgamation of Metal Gear Solid and Resident Evil, cost $1 million francs and took 2 months to plan. In US dollars, that's $1,040,735 in 2001. The equivalent today is likely about $1,650,000. As much fun as a paintball fight with Yamaoka Akira sounds, it seems like a lot for a little in my eyes. But then I'm not in publicity. Perhaps this fantastic stunt was worth its weight in gold. But as far as the development of Silent Hill 2 goes, it does reveal some interesting possibilities about the evolution of the game. One description of this event seems to document a very different version of Silent Hill 2's opening. The writer claims the Silent Hill 2 intro showed James driving into town. It also claims the message on the letter is the same as the one the journalists received. Silent Hill, our sanctuary of memories. I'll be waiting for you there. Either the writer confused the 2 letters or the document was changed later on. It also describes James receiving the letter and reacting to it with surprise and disbelief before entering a state of hysteria and driving into town. He finds the roadblock and so pulls back to find another entry point. That's when he finds the lookout and the path through the woods, arriving at the graveyard with Angela. Then the writer says that Angela looks exactly like Mary, a point that will be important in the game. At this point, it feels like the person's documentation cannot be fully accurate. When in the world was Angela ever supposed to be Maria? Were the 2 characters going to be the same? This is unlikely, since this event was in July 2001 and the game released in late September of that year, leaving only 2 months or so for changes. That would be an impossible change to make, so it's likely the author misunderstood the characters of Angela and Maria. It's also possible that some of this description is not from a video the journalists watched, but perhaps something the team described to them, which then had to be translated from Japanese to the multiple languages of the many countries represented in the crowd. What seems most likely is there was extra content in the beginning of the game, possibly more scenes depicting James's entrance to town, which were later cut. Advertising for Silent Hill 2 in Japan would hit a small snag. A poster meant to advertise the game had been deemed too mature for public consumption and could not be used in stores, a decision made sometime in or before August, only a month before the game's release. Depicting Pyramid Head from behind, looming over a collapsed nurse slumped on the floor, the image appears to be from the short film Fukuro rather than the actual game. Instead of admitting defeat, the decision was made to use the poster in a new way, advertising through their website, Konami style, about the removal of the poster. They made it a pre-order bonus for purchasing Silent Hill 2. Said pre-order would also come with a specialized mousepad depicting a bunch of monsters behind a nurse. They played up the horrifying elements of this forbidden poster, saying it was a rare item and that only the buyer will know what it looks like. Another poster for Silent Hill 2 that was approved centered on James's face looking into the mirror, and once again had a quote spread across the center. "It's a horror you shouldn't know." It's attributed to, of course, Suzuki Koji. Once again, the Silent Hill series pulls upon the popularity of the Ring author. Elsewhere, Silent Hill 2 in Japan had its own live-action event, though not on the level of Europe's. Tokyo is a huge city with plenty of unique secrets tucked away in its streets. There are dozens of themed restaurants throughout the city, and one of them would find a place in Silent Hill history, Alcatraz AD, a prison-themed restaurant in Ginza. Every Monday and Tuesday night in October 2001, a month after the game's release, the prison restaurant themed its performance on Silent Hill, staying open through the night to terrify and delight its guests. Monsters roamed the maze-like halls lit by dramatic lighting, and of course, you could buy copies of the game. In September of 2001, Silent Hill 2 began its global release. First in the United States and Canada around the 24th and the 26th, followed by Japan on the 27th. In Europe, it would release on November 23rd in the UK, France, Germany, Spain, the Netherlands, Holland, Poland, and Italy. Some new countries would receive official releases, including South Africa, and eventually Russia, who would receive a re-release of the special edition in 2009. Australia received their version in November, and a South Korean version would appear sometime in 2002. Silent Hill 2 would sell very well, receiving a platinum release, indicating it sold more than 400,000 units in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa in its first year. Further west, it received the Greatest Hits logo, meaning it sold 400,000 in the US and Canada too. Unfortunately, it would not receive the Best label that indicates similar sales numbers in Japan, nor would it reach South Korea's big hit label numbers. A Konami press release would reveal the game's early sales would total 650,000 units in the US and Japan, as well as around 400,000 pre-orders in Europe. By the end of its first year, it sold at least 1 million units, most of those coming from the United States. The game could hardly be called a failure. In fact, it was referenced in multiple documents as a major part of Konami's growth at the time, but it wasn't what anyone had expected or hoped for. After the explosive success of the first game, both the team and Konami Corporate had expected more growth. Members of the team had even pushed hard for a larger budget for their CGI and mocap, arguing that Silent Hill 2 would be an even bigger success than its previous title. But it unfortunately wasn't. It sold a lot less in Japan than the first game, and it had less sales globally. The budget had ballooned, almost doubling according to one team member. When you consider the costs, it makes sense. SatoWorks had 4 employees working in the United States, a project that became so expensive SatoWorks lost money on Silent Hill 2 and would eventually close. Back home, the team spent 4 months recording live-action mocap on a stage, with nearly the whole voice cast present. Multiple long-term publicity campaigns in Japan and Europe would have a cost, and we know Konami Europe spent more than $1 million on the Paris event alone. The team that made the game was more than 3 times the size of the first, numbering at 50 to 70 people at various points of development. Reviews at the time were certainly glowing, with many discussing the incredible craftsmanship and artistry of the game. It was beloved and recognized as a horror classic quite early on, but undercurrents of dissatisfaction existed in both the Eastern and Western fan bases. A Western writer discussing the game before its release wrote in his preview that Silent Hill 2 was going to explain the town and the events of the first game, an idea I think he may have invented for himself. Another interviewer asked the dev team if the ending of this game would be more concrete, because Western fans didn't like how the end of the first game explained nothing. They said that yes, it would. And they were telling the truth. James's story would have a solid ending. But Western fans wanted explanations for what Silent Hill and the other world are. And explanations are something that Japanese media, especially horror, rarely offers. The most famous horror artist of modern Japan is Ito Junji, whose works have influenced a generation of horror creators the world over. Having read nearly all his works, you'll find they rarely, perhaps never, explain anything. It's common in Japanese fiction. Ambiguity is preferred to certainty. Especially in horror, Japanese masters of the genre, like Hino Hideshi or Nagai Go, rarely give answers to the how or why of their scenarios. Westerners, however, are far more used to concrete explanations, to films that round up the cast and explain who was the dastardly criminal who did the deed, to ghost stories that have explanations for the tragic pasts of the dead spirit. Americans especially like answers, and some were not happy with the lack of answers Silent Hill was providing. Japanese fans had a similar but different complaint. They didn't want answers necessarily, but they wanted a sequel. They wanted more of Harry and Cheryl, a continuation of what happened to them after Silent Hill. In fact, initial reactions to Silent Hill 2 in Japanese forums were abysmal. To this day, you can find entire threads of people tearing into the game and calling it trash, saying they didn't know why the first game had to change when it was so good already. The problem was that a lot of what Japanese fans enjoyed about the first game, the strange unreality, the lack of coherence and dreamlike qualities, the harsh difficulty, the references to the occult and Western mysticism, they were all from Toyama Keiichiro. It was his decision to make the game hard, to use strange Western symbols and occultism, to write a story about a cult and a god. While all the team members grew up in the occult boom, none of them were as influenced by it as Toyama and Sato Naoko, both of whom had left at this point. Sato Takayoshi and Tsuboyama Masashi seemed to be far more literature-inspired. Sato studied philosophy in college. Tsuboyama focuses in interviews on how the team making the games are artists first, not gamers. They specifically wanted to create a coherent work of art, a movie-like experience, a piece of literary storytelling that was not dreamlike in the way the first game was. As opposed to alchemical references and unexplained occult symbols, Silent Hill 2 would use references to the Bible and philosophers like Nietzsche, aiming for a more artistic and less occultic experience. It was just not going to be what Konami expected. Being the first game to be created on a brand new, incredibly complex console, using new techniques and high-end technology to create something that had never been seen, a game that was more a movie and a work of art than anything before. It wasn't something the games industry had the ability to understand yet, and the gaming public didn't either. That would change with time. In the coming years, Silent Hill 2 would slowly permeate the consciousness of horror fans and the gaming public, inspiring a generation of horror writers and creators. Horror games would begin to create stories that centered on the psychological, on the mental and spiritual. They didn't just have to mimic slasher films and B-movies. They could tell artistic, deep, moving stories about humanity, and Silent Hill 2 is the game that paved the way for those experiences. At the time, however, it was not quite a success, not quite a failure. It wasn't what Konami had hoped it would be, and it would send the team back to the drawing board. But not before more team members left Silent Hill forever. Silent Hill 2 would be Sato's last game at Konami. He'd spend some time on a proposal for Silent Hill 3 which would be turned down, and a Frogger game which would be cancelled before leaving in 2003. From there, he went on to Electronic Arts, working on art direction and characters for GoldenEye Rogue Agent, a first-person shooter that released in 2004. It was followed by a project called Tiberium, which was cancelled in 2006. By then, Sato was at a frustrating point in his career. Games felt stagnated to him. Everything was about a specific genre, about violence and guns. There was nothing unique. One year at the game's developers conference, he happened to meet a man named Jerry Heinigen, who was employed with a company called Virtual Heroes. Virtual Heroes is a company that makes serious games. You've likely not played or even heard of many of them because they're aimed at an entirely different purpose than general public sales. From educational tools to employee tutorials to surgical simulators, serious games are meant to inform and explain. Sato met Hennigan at GDC and approached him, saying he really wanted to come work for Virtual Heroes. "Look, I'm at a point in my career where they don't actually let me produce anything, and I'm going nuts," he told the man. In 2007, he would be brought onto the Virtual Heroes team. In another interview, Sato explained that serious games presented to him the opportunity to do something unique, not just model another gun. Over time, he'd end up leading a small team on the creation of multiple games, some award-winning, even traveling back home to Japan to give a presentation on the topic of serious games. He remained there for about a decade, living and working in Raleigh, North Carolina, which happens to be my hometown. Eventually, he would move on from serious games, but he would hardly return to the generic violent games he'd grown tired of. In 2009, he worked as an artist and character designer for Tale of Tales on a project called Fatale, designing the main character Salome for a story based upon biblical tales. In 2012, he'd move on to Nintendo, working at times as visual producer or as art director on various Mario games, including the recent Luigi's Mansion 3 in 2019. Sato Takayoshi is an artist with a unique sensibility, especially with horror. He laments that the first Silent Hill couldn't focus more on building an intricate story, and he feels Silent Hill 3 went too far back towards traditional shock and gore, as opposed to 2. It's clear his personal preference is for the cerebral, the kind of horror that comes from within. In one interview, Sato spoke of how it mattered more to him to create something that would last with people, a work of art that would stay with them, rather than one that would make a quick buck. It is undoubtedly true that with Silent Hill 2, he has done that, as the game has remained so influential so many years after its original release. Silent Hill 2 was made by an enormous and ever-growing team of people, many of whom were also working on multiple games at the same time. Most of those were also working on Shadow of Destiny. More than 12 people are shared between the credits of both titles. Many of them would leave Silent Hill behind after the second title. Michael Miller worked for Midway Games for 6 years, Warner Brothers for 11, working on the Injustice series, and finally Disney Interactive for 8 years, working on Disney Infinity. Ueda Hideo joined Konami sometime around 1987 and worked as a programmer on numerous games since. He would work on Metal Gear Solid 3 Subsistence after finishing his work on Restless Dreams, and was employed by Konami through at least 2012. Ando Takayuki, a member of the original Silent Hill 1 team, would go on to become involved in Contra: Shattered Soldier, before going on to direct his own game in the series, Neo Contra. A game series focused heavily on combat, Contra has long been a Konami staple. For Ando, the focus on Neo Contra was friendship. He remembered the times when gamers would play side by side in the arcade or join up in their living room, and he wanted to create a game that would encourage that kind of atmosphere. It would be the first game in the series to receive an M rating. He would remain with Konami until at least 2011, but has since left. Yamaguchi Hiroto's career would span multiple Castlevania games in major roles. Starting as a character designer on Dracula X, he would work on Symphony of the Night and Lament of Innocence as a designer and modeler. In Aria of Sorrow, he'd take on a larger role, enough so to be called the backbone of the design team. He would design maps and the overall games of Aria, Dawn of Sorrow, and Order of Ecclesia, but no game was more influenced by him than Portrait of Ruin, in which he was an enemy designer, chief designer, map designer, and scenario writer. Silent Hill 2 is one of his rare non-Castlevania roles.
In my restless dreams, I see that town. Silent Hill.
It would take time for the world to understand what it had been given with Silent Hill 2. The conversation about mature-themed adult games had been going on for years, but when one finally came around, no one recognized it. We didn't have the tools to understand it yet. The desire to explore them as a medium of art just wasn't there. Silent Hill 2 was a game that had no connections to its previous title. It didn't explain why anything was happening. It changed what most had liked about the first game. It was strange. Well, at least the last part is right. Silent Hill 2 is a strange and wondrous experience. And though its development and the choices made had consequences for the series as a whole, I for one am incredibly glad it is exactly the game we received. With time, it would become a staple of the horror genre, influencing entire generations of games developers. Nearly every list of the most popular, influential, or best games would include Silent Hill 2 on it in the decades to come. But at the time, for the team behind the game, it wasn't exactly what they'd expected. Japanese message boards after the first game had glowed with praise and excitement. After the second game, they were angry, disappointed, incredibly negative. To this day, it's undoubtedly true that the first Silent Hill is the Japanese favorite, and Silent Hill 2 is the ugly stepchild that some fans simply haven't come around to. Still, the game had been successful, and in the months following its release, Konami would start to develop a third title.
James, you made me happy.